Warning. This report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Chapter 2: Enslavement. Introduction. 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a speech to a crowd of 600 mostly white anti-slavery activists in Rochester, New York, the day after Independence Day. Douglass was one of the most famous black anti-slavery and civil rights activists at the time. He began by praising the courage of the nation's founders in winning their freedom from the British Empire. But Douglass did not come to celebrate American independence and liberty. States was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, but white Americans enslaved their fellow African Americans and notoriously hate all men whose skins are not colored like your own. 5 For Douglass, the 4th of July only highlighted the immeasurable distance between free white Americans and enslaved African Americans. 6 The blessings in which you, this day, rejoice, are not enjoyed in common, the rich inheritance of justice, prosperity, and independence, bequeathed by is shared by you, not by me, he explained. You may rejoice. 7. Douglass's speech about the 4th of July shows the conflict at the heart of American history. The United States prides itself on liberty, equality, and justice for all, but for over 400 years, white people of European ancestry built and continued a brutal caste system based on false notions of racial difference. White people at the top, people of African descent at the bottom, and all other groups ranked in between. From the beginning, America's wealth was built by the forced labor of people from Africa and their descendants. PLE were forcibly sold and traded as commodities, and millions of them cultivated crops, tobacco, sugar, rice, indigo, wheat, corn, and especially cotton, that allowed American colonies in the early United States to prosper. Governments and the U.S. government at all levels allowed and participated in the exploitation, abuse, terror, and murder of people of African descent so people could profit as much as possible from enslavement. Stealing the intellect, skill, and labor of African Americans, enslavers created and spread false, racist ideas that African Americans were less intelligent than whites, that they loved their children less than white parents, and that they felt less pain than white people did. Ronin Pictures / print collector / Getty Images. Being brought on board of a slave ship on the west coast of Africa. 1880. 89. Chapter 2: Enslavement. That African Americans were less than human made it easier for enslavers and the American government at all levels to deny them the legal rights that many white Americans believed were a basic part of being American. Enslavement officially ended in 1865. White Americans terrorized African Americans with violence and racist ideas. Americans lived under violent threats to themselves and their families and did not have the economic opportunities or political rights of their white peers. Allowing, promoting, and protecting enslavement, federal, state, and local governments were complicit in stealing centuries of unpaid wages from African Americans. Ideas invented to control enslaved people have echoed through centuries of American laws and policies and inflicted physical, mental, and emotional trauma on approximately 16 generations of African Americans. And federal governments of this country have accounted for these harms. Chapter traces the long arc of enslavement in North America and the United States. Sections 3 and 4 examine the origins of race-based enslavement. People of African ancestry, the way slavery generated wealth for white colonists in English North America, and the emergence of transatlantic trafficking in enslaved African people. Section 5 discusses the importance of enslavement to the founding of the United States from the American Revolution to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. 6, 7, and 8 describe the lives of enslaved people during the height of the domestic slave trade, the complicity of Northerners in the perpetuation of enslavement, and enslavement's importance to American educational, religious, and governmental institutions. 9 discusses the expansion of enslavement into western U.S. territories, the establishment of enslavement in California, and the complicity of the California state government in promoting enslavement, oppressive laws, and anti-black sentiment. Sections X, 11, and 12 conclude by examining the U.S. Civil War, the formal ABO of enslavement, policies toward formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. Considering the lingering, harmful effects of efforts to recast the defeat of the Confederate States of America into a lost cause myth that endures to the present day. The origins of American enslavement. Modern enslavement has existed for thousands of years in many different cultures across the world. It's only in the past 400 to 500 years that white Europeans developed a type of enslavement based heavily on the color of someone's skin and that mainly targeted people of African ancestry. This type of enslavement developed gradually between the 1400s and the 1700s. It was based on the ideas that African ancestry could be the basis for lifelong enslavement, that the children of enslaved African-descended women could be enslaved from birth, and that people of African descent were naturally destined to be enslaved. 12. 1800s, a time period known as the pre-modern era, enslavement and enslaved people differed widely. 13 In the ancient Roman Empire, for instance, those who were enslaved were mostly conquered people who came from multiple racial, ethnic, religious, and class backgrounds across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. In the Middle Ages, 600s to 1400s, Celtic peoples, North Africans, Scandinavians, and especially Slavic people from Eastern Europe, from whom the word slave were the most commonly enslaved groups in Europe. In the Muslim kingdoms of North Africa and the Middle East, both Slavic people and sub-Saharan African people, Africans who lived south of the Sahara Desert, made up a large number of those who were enslaved. 16. Enslaved people in these diverse societies became enslaved in different ways. They could be prisoners of war, victims of kidnapping, targets of religious crusades, sentenced to enslavement as a punishment for crimes, or poor people sold to pay off debts. Depending on the culture or time period, children born to one or more enslaved parent were not always automatically enslaved, and it was fairly common for enslavers to free. Justify stealing the intellect, skill, and labor of African. Enslavers created and spread false, racist ideas that Americans were less intelligent than whites, that they children less than white parents, and that they felt than white people. 50. 2. Enslavement. Grandchildren or great-grandchildren of enslaved people. Finally, early enslaved people fulfilled a variety of roles in their societies beyond being forced agricultural laborers or house servants. Enslaved people could be status symbols who represented the wealth and power of their enslavers, trusted advisors, poorly treated members of their enslavers' extended families, coerced sexual and marriage partners, or slave soldiers forced into military service. Modern enslavement changed with European world explorer tie-in and global colonization between the 1400s and the 1600s. North America and South America, English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Dutch colonizers took indigenous peoples' land to grow crops such as sugarcane, tobacco, rice, and coffee, and to mine for gold. 2. These new colonies, natural resources, and land to grow crops were common, but laborers were scarce. In order to efficiently exploit these resources, Europeans first captured, enslaved, and exploited the indigenous peoples of North and South America. Or because the enslavement of indigenous people could not keep up with the demand for labor, European colonizers began to traffic enslaved people from the continent of Africa. 5. And Spanish colonizers brought the first enslaved Africans to North and South America to supplement forced indigenous labor. Portuguese merchants had been trafficking West Africans and selling them in Portugal for many years before the colonization of North and South America. 7. It was these captives who were first forcibly moved in small groups to European colonies across the Atlantic Ocean. Portuguese and Spanish colonizers eventually started buying thousands of enslaved Africans along the coasts of West Africa and Central Africa and bringing them directly to colonies in the Caribbean and Brazil. 9. Around 500,000 enslaved people of African descent had already arrived in North and South America. 30, including Spanish settlements in present-day South Carolina, by 1526, 31 in Florida, by 1539, 32, by the time Dutch pirates sold around 20 African captives to English colonists in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. 3. American racial hierarchy. When these first Africans were brought by force to the English colonies that became the United States, a caste system based mostly on skin color did not yet fully exist. European colonists who wanted to exploit enslaved black people and profit from their labor built this caste system gradually during the 1600s and 1700s. Earliest years of English colonization in Virginia, European indentured servants were the most common workers. Indentured servants were usually either poor people who agreed to work for wealthy people for several years in exchange for transportation to the colonies, or they were people found guilty of crimes who had to work for several years in the colonies before getting their freedom. 5. First, there was not much difference between the treatment of enslaved Africans and European indentured servants. The major divisions in Virginia were between wealthy people and poor people who were forced to labor, not between black and white people. 7 wealthy white Virginians who controlled the colony and profited from the labor of both indentured white people and enslaved African people feared that rebellions by these lower-class people might undermine their power and wealth. 8. White colonists attempted to solve this problem by using race as a way to divide these two groups and stay in power. Rich white Virginians began to grant more rights and privileges to poorer white people. Move created a false sense of greater equality among rich and poor white English colonists, who began to come together around a shared idea that they were white people who were naturally superior to black people. Slavery, probably Jamestown, Virginia, late 1610s. Keene Collection / Getty Images. 1. 2. Enslavement. Descent. And the new unity between rich and poor white people in Virginia encouraged poor whites to keep Africans and their descendants enslaved and to help their wealthy neighbors squash rebellions of enslaved people. 2. Lawmakers then established new laws that made the racial caste system a permanent part of American culture and society. 3. Colonial laws aimed to control people of African descent, keep them in lifelong enslavement, and keep poor whites and enslaved African-descended people divided. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, these colonial laws gradually built up a legal system that treated people of African descent as permanent outsiders whose skin color made them naturally different from and unequal to all white people. 45. These Virginia laws, called slave codes, did the following. Permanent and automatic for most people of African descent by saying that children born to enslaved mothers would be enslaved for life. 46. That becoming a Christian would not end enslavement. 47. And that enslavers could not set enslaved people free unless they paid to take them out of the Virginia colony. 48. Easier for whites to control free people of African descent, those born into freedom or who did manage to escape enslavement, by denying them political and social rights. These included the right to vote, serve in colonial military organizations, have political office, or carry firearms. 50. And did all white people from all black people by making interracial sex or marriage a crime. 51. Punishing white women who gave birth to mixed-race children. 52. And forcing these mixed-race children, and their children, into indentured servitude until they were 31 years old. 3. Colonies that depended on enslavement passed similar laws across the 1700s, sometimes copying the laws of Virginia directly. 54. These early slave codes ensured that this racial caste system became widespread across much of the area that would later become the United States. 5. After enslavement became widespread and profitable and racist policies were in place, did white people develop elaborate racist ideas to explain why the racial caste system was natural and good? 6 European enslavers argued either that enslavement civilized Africans by introducing them to European climates and lifeways, or that the Christian Bible had automatically cursed them to suffer enslavement. 57 The overall goal of these racist ideas was to defend enslavement and white supremacy by claiming that black people were, and always had been, inferior to white people with European ancestry. D8. Transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people. Growth of slavery, the search for profits, the unity of rich and poor white colonists, and the development of racist ideas paved the way for the massive increase of slaving voyages to Africa and the enslavement of people of African descent in the lands that would later become the United States. 9. The people of African descent played a major role in the population boom of English colonies in North America during the 1700s. 60 enslaved Africans and African-descended peoples made up 47.5% of all people who arrived in the English colonies between 1700 and 1775, around 278,400 of the 585,800 new arrivals documented during this period. 61 This meant that the transatlantic slave trade was nearly as important to the growth of English North America as free, or indentured, immigration from Europe. 62 Populations of the English colonies showed this change. Between 1680 and 1750, people of African descent increased from 7% to 44% of the total population of Virginia, and from 17% to 61% of the total population of South Carolina. This trend was even more pronounced in the nearby British colonies of the Caribbean, known as the West Indies, where almost 1 million enslaved Africans were forcibly brought during the same period of time, 64, and where enslaved people made up 80 to 90% of the total population. 5. Profits of enslavement growing. British merchants, the British monarchy, and the British government worked together to become the leaders of the transatlantic slave trade. 6. Just one English company, the Royal African Company, forcibly brought nearly 150,000 enslaved people from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean between the early 1670s and the early 1720s. 7. This total was more than any single company in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. 8. D2. Chapter 2 Enslavement. Transatlantic slave trade of the 1600 to 1700s differed from the slave trades which existed in West Africa before or during the same period. 69. Enslavement was common in sub-Saharan Africa, including West Africa, which, in addition to Central Africa, was one of the main areas of the transatlantic slave trade. In West African societies, enslaved people were usually people captured in wars or attacks on other ethnic or lineage, family ancestry, groups, people who owed debts, or people found guilty of crimes. 1. Enslaved people in West African societies also had a wide variety of social and economic roles. Many, especially children, lived in the same home as their enslavers and were treated as pawns, low-status members of the family group. 73. Some worked in agriculture or as house servants, while some became wives or concubines, involuntary sex UAL partners or secondary wives. 54. This enslavement, usually permanent or passed on to the next. 75. Most enslaved people and their children in West Africa gradually lost their enslaved status and became part of the families and communities of their enslavers. 6. Arrival of Europeans made enslavement along the western coast of Africa more widespread and violent. 77 European enslavers depended on African slave trade ING networks for captives to send across the Atlantic Ocean. 8. But the massive demand for African captives, which kept growing as Europeans colonized more areas of the world, changed African enslavement greatly. 79 Warfare and kidnapping raids increased to capture more people to sell to Europeans. The focus of the West African slave trade also shifted to the coasts and port cities where Europeans set up trading forts to buy people who had been captured. Transatlantic slave trade eventually involved capturing Africans from an enormous geographic area covering much of West Africa and Central Africa, and even extending to the island of Madagascar off the southeast coast of Africa. This trafficking in human beings spanned 3,500 miles along the western African coast from present-day Senegal in the north to present-day Angola in the south, and as many as 500 to 1,000 miles into the interior of the continent. 83 Captive African people often changed hands many times and traveled long distances before they arrived at coastal ports where Europeans bought them. Passage African captives suffered horrific physical, emotional, and mental trauma before and during the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. This journey was called the Middle Passage, and it was so dangerous, unhealthy, and violent that almost 1.8 million people died before they ever reached the Americas. 6. African suffering began even before the slave ships set sail for the Americas. Once European enslavers purchased people who had been captured from African enslavers, they incarcerated them for days, weeks, or even months until they were ready to sail. In the earlier years of the slave trade, European enslavers imprisoned enslaved people in large corrals called barracoons. The most common practice, however, was to incarcerate enslaved people on board the slave ships until it was time to sail for the Americas. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean, enslaved Africans went through months of torture, trapped inside slave ships. The voyage, which was called the Middle Passage because it was the second leg of a triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, 92 took 80 to 100 days, around 2.5 to 3 months or more, in the early years of the trade, although new sailing technology cut the length of the trip to 60 to 80 days in later years. Slaving ships came in many different sizes, but the average Royal African Company boat held around 330 enslaved people. 4. African men, who made up around 2/3 of all those captured, 95 spent almost all of the journey, 16 hours or more every day, laying down in specially constructed rooms inside the ships. Crews stripped them naked, chained them up, 97, and forced them to lay down on their sides, or to lay head to feet, so that they could fit in as many people as possible. 88 on English slave ships, each man had a space smaller than the size of a coffin. 59 on ships with tight packing, captains added an extra platform so that men laid in 2 rows stacked on top of each other with only 2.5 feet of vertical space to lay down. 100 enslaved women and children, who were USU allied smaller in number, lived together in groups in small rooms inside the ship. 101. 1.8 million Africans died as they were trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean to slavery. 3. 2. Enslavement. Inside slave ships were horrific and caused massive amounts of sickness and death. 102 hundreds of people were crowded together in the blazing heat and tossed back and forth with the ship's movement, especially during bad weather. 3. Enslaved captive Alada Equiano, who survived the Middle Passage, wrote that the closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. 104. Not have much fresh air, and their rooms were covered with human waste. 5 rats and insects swarmed around them. 106 low-quality food, as well as scarce water, led to widespread lack of nutrition and dehydration. 7 filthy conditions and poor nutrition caused waves of sickness, including scurvy, a lack of vitamins B and C, and bloody flux, amoebic diarrhea or dysentery. 108 highly contagious diseases, especially smallpox, spread fast in the overcrowded spaces. 109 of slave ships were filled with people who were very sick, dying, or dead. Africans also suffered physical and sexual violence at the hands of ship's crews. 110 crew members moved people who had been captured to the top deck of the ship on a regular basis to force them to bathe and dance for exercise. Then they often raped and impregnated women and girls. 12 heavily armed crew members watched enslaved people carefully, and they threatened, tortured, and sometimes killed them, especially if they resisted or rebelled. 113. Evidence that ship crews threw sick enslaved people overboard to prevent them from spreading disease to others and to claim insurance money for lost human cargo. In one especially brutal case in 1781, an English slave ship captain ordered his crew to throw 132 Africans overboard because he had run out of supplies and his insurance company would only pay him if enslaved people, not if they starved to death. During the worst storms, crews also tried to keep from sinking by throwing enslaved people overboard to decrease the weight of the ship. After the 16, British insurance companies allowed this and paid ship captains for any human beings who their crews threw overboard to drown. 117. Transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage had a sickening cost in human lives. Enslavers forced around 12.5 million enslaved Africans to cross the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1866. More than 14% of these people, around 1.8 million in total, died of sickness, neglect, abuse, murder, or suicide. The men, women, and children who survived the Middle Passage were then sold to local slave traders, merchants, or owners of plantations and forced labor camps. 20. Voyage across the Atlantic Ocean finally ended in North America, South America, or the Caribbean. Enslaved Africans suffered social death, which meant they were now permanently separated from their home communities, cultures, and families. 121. They were outsiders in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers with completely different cultures, religions, and languages. Africans had to build new families, languages, cultures, and religious practices rooted both in the pre-colonial traditions of engraving stowage of the British slave ship brooks under the Regulated Slave Trade Act of 1788, circa 1788. Courtesy of Library of Congress/Art Images via Getty Images. Enslaved Africans naked, chained them up, and to lay down on their sides, or to lay head to feet, so fit in as many people as possible. Slave ships, each man had a space smaller than the size of a coffin. 4. Chapter 2. Enslavement. Homelands and the new cultures that they found in the Americas. 122. And the founding of the United States starting in the late 1600s, enslaved people and the institution of enslavement became increasingly important to the colonial societies of North America that would later become the United States. 23. The Southern English colonies of North America, which eventually included Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, began trafficking more and more enslaved people as the 1700s went on. 24. Gradually built economies and societies that depended heavily on enslavement for growing cash crops to sell in international markets. 25. In the colonies of the Upper South, including Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and North Carolina, enslaved people grew tobacco. People in the low country and coastal plains of the Carolinas and Georgia grew rice and indigo, a plant for making blue dye. 26. Slavers who forced enslaved people to labor in agricultural production exploited not only their physical strength, but also their intellect, innovation, and skill. Rice and indigo, for instance, required skilled labor and knowledge of specialized techniques for successful production. 7. In fact, rice and indigo growing was already highly developed along the western coast of Africa, and, later the Caribbean, where people of African descent had already innovated several production techniques. 128 enslavers were eager to buy enslaved people who already had these specialized agricultural skills. 129. Trafficking in enslaved people was not limited to the southern colonies. 130 whites in northern Colorado Nice also trafficked enslaved people, and enslavement became a feature of life in every northern colony. 31 In most New England colonies, enslavement was not a major institution, but in colonies farther south, such as New York, enslavement was often a part of daily life. 2. For example, 1/5 of New York City's population was enslaved in 1746, making it the second largest slavehold city in the 13 original English colonies behind only Charleston, South Carolina. 33. English colonists began to complain about their mistreatment by the British government and began comparing their lack of rights in the British Empire to enslavement. The real enslavement of people of African descent was already well established in all 13 original British colonies. Or 500,000 enslaved black people, who made up 20% of the entire colonial population, knew the real horrors and trauma of enslavement. American Revolution. When white colonists declared their independence from Great Britain, they explained their actions by saying that the King of England and the British government had taken away their freedom and their rights as freeborn Englishmen, 136 in the Declaration of Independence. Americans famously announced that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the happiness. 137. At the same time, these same colonists bought and sold people of African descent who had no freedom and very few rights. People who opposed the American Revolution were quick to point out the hypocrisy of these words. 38. Thomas Day, an Englishman who opposed enslavement, said that, if there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot, signing resolutions of independence with the one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. 139. Even white American colonists understood the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence. 40. Abigail Adams, an opponent of enslavement from New England, the wife of John Adams, and a future First Lady of the United States, wondered just how strongly white colonists felt about human liberty. Slavers who forced enslaved people to labor in agricultural exploited not only their physical strength, but also intellect, innovation, and skill. Rice and indigo. 4. Required skilled labor and knowledge of specialized for successful production. Rice and indigo was already highly developed along the western coast of Africa, and, later the Caribbean, where people of African descent innovated several production techniques. Slavers, eager to buy enslaved people who already had these agricultural skills. 5. Chapter 2. Enslavement. Were accustomed to deprive their fellow citizens of theirs. 141. Founders of the United States, especially those who owned enslaved people and profited from enslavement, were well aware of these contradictions, and they tried to play them. Enslavement made them, and their independence movement, look hypocritical, but they also wanted to continue to profit from the stolen labor of enslaved people. Jefferson, the author of the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, owned around 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. 42. His original draft of the Declaration of Independence openly criticized the transatlantic slave trade, which he called a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, but he blamed it almost all on King George III of England. 43. Jefferson claimed that the king not only failed to stop the slave trade, but also that the king encouraged enslaved people to rise up and kill white colonists. 144. Over enslavement, and the hope to keep making money from it, was clear when the Continental Congress rejected this part of the Declaration and voted to remove it. 45. Jefferson explained the rejection in his notes. 146 representatives from South Carolina and Georgia depended on enslavement and wanted to continue in the trafficking of humans. 147 men from the northern colonies were embarrassed by the criticism of the slave trade because they were highly involved in shipping enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. 48. The final version of the Declaration of Independence only mentioned enslavement indirectly by claiming that King George III was trying to cause domestic insurrections, code words for rebellions by enslaved people, in the colonies. 49. Founders of the United States tried to dodge the issue of enslavement, but enslaved and free people of African would not let them. The new nation's ideas of freedom during the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. 150. Around 30,000 to 40,000 people, and maybe as many as 100,000 people, escaped their enslavement during the American Revolution. 51. Virginia's colonial governor, John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, quickly took advantage of enslavement in the colonies by promising freedom to any enslaved man who fought for the British Army against the Americans. In 1952, some male freedom seekers did join the British Army, but large numbers died from smallpox during their service. 153 others, including many women and children, took advantage of wartime chaos to escape to areas where the British Army was strong. 154 The massive number of freedom seekers greatly damaged enslavement in the lower southern states. 155 For instance, around 30% of South Carolina's enslaved population left or died during the Revolution. 156 States tried to solve this problem by promising freedom to enslaved men who fought on the side of the Americans. 157 other states recruited free black men to boost the size of the small American army. Even though they were smaller in number than whites, free black men were more likely to volunteer for military service and to serve longer than whites because they wanted both independence for the United States and greater rights for themselves. 59 overall, around 9,000 free or enslaved African American men served alongside white revolutionaries in integrated military units to fight for American independence. 160 Americans' struggles for freedom during the American Revolution led to the end of the enslavement in most of the northern states where the enslaved population was small and local enslavement was less central to the economy. 61 Enslaved people used the revolutionary ideals of freedom to convince northern judges and the general public to end enslavement. 162 Enslaved people in Massachusetts sued for their freedom. The state courts decided that enslavement went against the state's new constitution, which said that all men are born free and equal. 163 Enslavement ended there in 1783. 4 Nearby, the state of Vermont AP proved a new constitution that outlawed enslavement completely in 1777. 165 states farther south, such as New Thomas Jefferson, the author of the first draft of the Declaration, owned around 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. He freed only 10 of the 600 people enslaved over the course of his life. Of those 10, his own children with Sally Hemings and enslaved, women who he owned as his property and who he never freed. 6. 2. Enslavement. In Pennsylvania, depended much more on enslavement and so passed gradual emancipation laws to cover enslavers' loss of profits. 1966, these laws required children born to enslaved mothers to go through a long indenture, up to 28 years, and then be set free. 167. States that profited the most from enslavement kept and rebuilt it, but the process looked different in the Upper and Lower South. States in the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, temporarily began to relax their laws against freeing enslaved people. 68 Manumission, the legal process by which enslavers freed enslaved people or outlawed them to save money and purchase their freedom, became more common. 9. This was partly because the Revolutionary War had hurt the market for tobacco and made enslavement less profitable in the Upper South. 170 Revolutionary ideas about human freedom also motivate some of this manumission, although with limits. 171, for instance, Virginian George Washington, leader of the Revolutionary Army and the first president of the United States, freed all of the people he enslaved, but only upon his death. 172. However, was not the norm. Jefferson, the next slaveholder from Virginia to win the presidency, willingly freed only 10 of the 600 people who he had enslaved over the course of his life. In 73, 4 of those 10 people were his own children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who he owned as his property and who he never freed. 174. His fellow white Southerners in the Upper South increasingly stopped manumission when they found that selling surplus enslaved people to cotton growers in South Carolina and Georgia could be a profitable replacement for tobacco. 75. Meanwhile, the lower or deep South states rebuilt their plantation economies by buying enslaved people from the Upper South and trafficking in large numbers of enslaved Africans from the Transatlantic slave trade. 176. The American Revolution created a new nation that was increasingly divided into three regions: the North, where enslavement was immediately or gradually ended; the Upper South, where older patterns of enslavement were; and the Lower South, where enslavement remained an important and growing part of the economy. Cotton economy and the expansion of slavery. Instead of dying out after the American Revolution, enslavement became the economic lifeblood of the United States, North and South. Winning independence, the United States built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. Between the end of the American Revolution in 1783 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, roughly the length of one human lifetime, the enslaved population of the United States increased almost 5 times, from just under 650,000 enslaved individuals to almost 4 million enslaved people. 178. Major processes made this possible. New technologies for producing cotton increased the value of enslaved people's labor and encouraged the expansion of enslavement into lands in the Deep South. 179. White Americans adopted a national constitution that protected enslavement and gave pro-slavery white Americans outsized political power in the federal government. This power allowed enslavers to increase the profits of enslavement and to enjoy those profits with little regulation by the federal government. In the 1790s, new technologies made enslavement more profitable than ever in North America. Machine, the cotton gin, made it much easier and faster to remove the seeds from short staple cotton, a breed of cotton that could be grown in many different climates and soils in the South. 81. Cotton growing breathed new life into the institution of enslavement. Enslavers looked for new lands to the west to expand cotton plantations. 182. Help these land-hungry cotton planters, the United States government increasingly pressured Native Americans in the Deep South to give up their homelands. 183. Native Americans in the southeastern United States, some of whom had adopted the practices of white colonizers such as growing cotton and owning enslaved African Americans, resisted this pressure. 184. The U.S. eventually used a brutal policy of removal in which soldiers rounded up Native Americans, removed them from their land, and force-marched, or sailed, them hundreds of miles to lands west of the Mississippi River. 85. People of African descent enslaved by Native Americans were also forcibly moved west with their enslavers, and some Native Americans even purchased more enslaved people to take west with them. 186. Thousands of Native Americans and an unknown number of enslaved African Americans died from disease and neglect along the way, and the removal process came to as the Trail of Tears. 187. As white Southern caught planters moved into Native homelands, the removal, death, and land theft suffered by Native Americans went hand in hand with the widespread enslavement and forced relocation of African Americans. Slavery in the new U.S. Constitution. Around the same time that the cotton gin took off, Southern enslaving states left a permanent mark on the American legal system by shaping the U.S. Constitution to meet their needs in upholding enslavement. Constitutional Convention in 1787, Southern pro-slavery representatives pushed for protections for enslavement, partly by threatening not to sign on to the new Constitution. In 88. After protection for enslavement in the Constitution came in a clause that prohibited Congress from outlawing U.S. participation in the transatlantic slave trade for another 20 years. 1989. During those important 20 years, slave ships legally brought around 86,000 enslaved Africans to the United States. Congress was also required, and given the power, to use military force to stop insurrections and domestic violence. 191, which would have included rebellions by enslaved people. 192. Pro-slavery Southerners also ensured that the Constitution included a fugitive slave law, which required the return of enslaved people who sought freedom across state lines. 193. Important pro-slavery constitutional policy was the 3/5 Clause. The Constitution was built on the idea of representative government and that Americans should elect people to represent their needs and interests in the federal government. House of Representatives, the number of representatives each state got was based on population, with the idea that more populous states should get more representation than less populous states. For this part of the Constitution raised controversial questions. Was it reasonable or fair for Southern states with large numbers of enslaved people to count those people toward their congressional representation when they allowed enslaved people no vote, no political rights, and very few legal rights? Enslavers usually treated enslaved people as property. Why should they suddenly be counted as people for purposes of representation? 195 people who opposed counting people toward congressional representation, mostly from the North, and they argued that the enslaved population should give little or no boost to Southern states' power. 6. At the same time, enslavers demanded to count the enslaved as whole people, not because they believed enslaved people were equal to white Americans, but because they wanted more voice in Congress and to counterbalance the power of the more populous Northern states. In 1997, the authors of the Constitution reached a compromise. 198 states would get to count each enslaved person toward their representation in Congress, but each enslaved individual would only count as 3/5, or 60%, of a free white person when it came time to determine how many representatives each state received in the House. 9. This was an enormous benefit for enslavers. Continue to treat enslaved people as property, but still get to count 60% of the enslaved population toward getting more power in Congress. 200. Fathers embedded slavery into the U.S. Constitution by protecting the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people for another 20 years, resulting in the trafficking of 86,000 Africans. To Congress to use military force to stop insurrections, including slave rebellions. The return of enslaved people who fled towards freedom across state lines. Treating enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. 2. Enslavement. Representation in Congress also had a major influence on presidential elections. In 1901, the Constitution set up an electoral college in which a group of representatives, called electors, voted to choose the next president. Got a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives that it had in Congress. 2. In this way, enslaving states, which gained more representatives in Congress from the 3/5 clause, automatically gained more presidential electors and more power to influence presidential elections. 2. 103. At the same time, some historians argue that white Southerners would have gone even further to make the U.S. Constitution a pro-slavery document if they did not have to compromise with representatives from the northern states. And 4. The word slave and slavery could not be found anywhere in the new Constitution. Instead, it used code words for enslaved people such as person held to service or labor 205 or just other persons 206. Some historians see this as a sign that white Northerners who helped write the Constitution were growing less comfortable with enslavement and did not want the nation's founding document to say openly that owning human beings as property was legal. 107. The Constitution also gave Congress the power to end U.S. participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, rather than leaving it completely open, and the fugitive slave law was vague and not well enforced. Finally, the 3/5 clause probably disappointed pro-slavery Southerners who pushed hard for enslaved people to be counted as whole people, rather than as 60% of a person, for purposes of representation in Congress. 109. What the Constitutional Convention intended to do, the new Constitution ended up giving pro-slavery Southerners outsized power in the federal government, strengthening the institution of enslavement. 110 Northerners complained that the enslaving states' 60% boost in congressional representation and in the Electoral College, both due to the 3/5 clause, gave enslavers too much power over national politics. Some Northerners tried to get rid of the 3/5 clause. 111. Of congressional representation to presidential electors also helped pro-slavery Southerners control the White House. Thomas Jefferson, in 1800, and James K. Polk, in 1846, would not have won election to presidency without the South's extra electoral votes, based on counting enslaved people. 112. 50% of U.S. presidents from 1789 to 1885 enslaved African Americans. 21 presidents seated together in the White House. Enslavers are shaded in red. Courtesy of John Parrott/StockTrek Images via Getty Images. 59. Chapter 2, Enslavement. The power of pro-slavery white Southerners was evident throughout the United States early government. 80% of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers. Between George Washington's election and 1850, enslavers held the presidency for 50 years, the position of Speaker of the House for 41 years, and the chair of the House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee for 42 years. Control of the presidency also meant control of the U.S. Supreme Court, where presidents chose justices to serve for life. Made up 18 of the 31 justices, or 58%, who sat on the U.S. Supreme Court before 1850. Ultimately, throughout American history, more than 1,700 congressmen, representing 37 states, once enslaved black people. 116 they did not only represent the South, but also every state in New England, much of the Midwest, and many Western states. 117. Southerners' control of Congress, the presidency, and the U.S. Supreme Court increased the lifespan of enslavement and the geographic area where it was legal. Pro-slavery officials in the federal government paved the way for enslavement's expansion into new states and territories in the West by letting enslavers move without regulation into the large geographic area south of the Ohio River. 18. Ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, Congress approved. Creation of 9 new enslaving states, roughly 43% of all 21 new states. 19. This expansion of enslavement included parts of the new territory of Louisiana, which the United States purchased from France in 1803. Louisiana had long been an enslaving colony where sugar production based on enslaved labor was becoming a major source of wealth. 220 Louisiana became a state in 1812 and, by the time of the Civil War, produced 1/4 of the world's sugar and was the second richest state. 21. In addition to creating this major new enslaving state, enslavers won another big victory in 1820 when Congress voted, after protests by anti-slavery petitions, to let Missouri become a state with a constitution that both allowed enslavement and banned free African Americans from settling their. 222. The major trade-off that opponents of enslavement got from the Missouri Compromise was the policy that enslavement would be illegal in all parts of the Louisiana Territory located north of Missouri's southern border. 23. For the time being, white Americans reached an unsteady political peace over enslavement's westward expansion,